Hello, everyone, and welcome to CSBA's webinar, Analyzing the 2025-26 May Budget Revision. There's been a tremendous amount of anxiety about the budget and its potential impact on schools, particularly given the uncertainty economically at the state and the federal level. Now, based on the governor's announcement last week, we have additional data to inform our analysis and give you a better picture of what the eventual 2025-26 budget may look like for California public schools. We're eager to explain that to you and to field your questions to give you the information you need to make the best decision for your school communities. But before we get to the heart of the matter, we're going to deal with a couple housekeeping details to help you best participate in today's event. We have a dedicated question and answer section, but that will take place after all the panelists have presented, simply because that allows us to streamline the information and to respond to your questions in a more efficient manner. To pose your question, please use the Q&A icon, the two speech bubbles, which are highlighted there on the screen in front of you. You can submit your question at any time, but again, we will address all the questions at the end of the panelist presentation. And many of you often ask, will this presentation be recorded? Will we get access to the slides? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. Everybody who has registered for today's webinar will receive an email tomorrow containing both the PowerPoint deck as well as a recording of today's events. So now let's introduce the people who will be guiding you through the 2025-26 May Revise. We have with us today Patrick O'Donnell, CSBA's Chief of Governmental Relations, Chris Reeve, our Legislative Director, Erica Hoffman, who is the Deputy Legislative Director for State and Federal Programs, Carlos Machado, who is a Legislative Advocate at CSBA, as well as Dan Merwin, also a Legislative Advocate. I'm Troy Flint, the Chief Communications Officer at CSBA, and I will be your moderator. Thanks again, everyone, for tuning in. Now we will get to the heart of the budget, and Patrick O'Donnell will give us an overview of the May Revise.
Okay, I'm going to jump right into it. My video won't go on because I'm blocked. But let's talk about what is the May Revise. As it suggests, it's a revision. It's a revision of the state budget. The governor shares his budget in early January. He hands it over to the legislature. Time goes on. The legislature starts working on the budget. Then by May 14th, the governor is required to give an update on the budget. So what the May Revise simply is an update on the budget numbers, the tax collections from April, and also an update on the governor's priorities. Okay. So again, the May 15th, the income tax comes in, they count it up. The governor then puts forward a May Revise based on the tax collections and again includes his policy updates. Okay. It's an update on the state general fund for the current year and the coming budget year. The governor's proposals to expand or reduce programs and expenditures again. State law also requires the May Revise to give an update on Proposition 98 funding, which of course is very important to us. To our next slide. This year, unfortunately, we now have a budget deficit. Now, when the governor first handed his budget over in January, we did not at all have a budget deficit. In fact, he projected a surplus of $363 million. Now, due to a variety of factors, he's saying we have a $12 billion deficit. And that is caused by a variety of things. Federal budget actions could very much impact the state budget. And that's going on right now in Washington, D.C. as we speak. The actions they're taking could have great effect on education funding in California and other funding in California. So watch that closely. And I know Erica is going to talk about that very shortly. Growth in healthcare costs. A few years ago, the legislature brought more folks into Medi-Cal, and those costs are growing very rapidly, much more rapidly than had been projected. So again, those are two factors, but there's also a third, and it's kind of unusual. There's the fires. Why would the wildfires impact the budget in the May Revise or the state budget? Well, very simply because the governor delayed tax collections on a couple counties, Ventura and LA, until October 15th. So he really doesn't know, we really don't know what the budget numbers are going to be. So a lot of this is merely projection.
Good morning. I'll cover the Prop 98 situation currently. So the revised minimum guarantee for the current year, that's 24-25, is just under $119 billion. If you recall, in January, it was slightly higher than that. We've actually seen a drop in projections of about 300 million below the January estimate. For the 25-26 year, the coming budget year, the minimum guarantee is now estimated to be 114.6 billion. That's also down about 4.3 billion. So when accounting for a few programs that are not split between TK through 12 and community colleges, there's about $110 billion that gets divvied up between those two groups. TK through 12 gets about 89% of it. So there'll be about 98.4 billion or so for TK through 12 education, with the remaining 12, or about 11%, going to community colleges to fund programs over on that side of 98. The revised 3-year estimate for Prop 98 is listed here below. I've already covered both the current and budget year, but want to speak briefly to the prior year, 23-24. That does remain at 98.5 billion. And if you may recall, there was a suspension of Prop 98 in that year, and that is why that is not changed, but the other 2 years are. That's still suspended by about $8 billion. Now, continuing on, according to the Department of Finance, if you take the entire 3 years in the budget window from 23-24 up to 25-26, we are now projecting an approximate increase in 98 funding of $2.9 billion over what was included in the Budget Act last year. Now, in January, that projected increase was actually $7.5 billion. So that has dropped by $4.6 billion. But putting this in another context, or stating it another way, Prop 98 is still expected to grow, just not as much as we expected it 5 months ago. Importantly, Prop 98 does continue operating under Test 1 in both the current year and the budget year, so that means local property taxes really factor into the amount of funding that's available for education. And that does, as a reminder, remain at about 39.6% of the overall state general fund goes to Prop 98. Moving on to the Prop 98 reserve, our rainy day fund. If you may recall, in January, the budget estimated that there'd be 2 mandatory payments required, or 2 mandatory deposits, which would have brought that balance up to about 1.5 billion. That deposit, and all those deposits, are driven by a formula with the new revised revenue numbers. It's actually going to only be one deposit of about $540 million, and that'll be in the current year. However, the withdrawals are also dictated by a formula, so the entire amount will be withdrawn in 25-26 in the coming year. So that means that at the end of 25-26, there will be nothing left in the Prop 98 reserve, but that also means there won't be a local reserve cap triggered, which happens when you get above 3% of Prop 98 levels. As for the COLA, that has been revised down slightly as well. You may notice a trend here. It is now 2.3%. Factoring in changes to ADA and enrollment, it looks like that's an increase in LCFF of $2.1 billion. Of course, county offices of education get this, as well as most programs that have historically received the COLA. They're listed there. There is one very notable exception that we will get to in a couple more slides. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. So, as many of you are probably aware, we saw in January a proposal that gave us some great concern, and we're kind of, calling it maneuver number 2. So, as you might recall, last year, the budget adopted a maneuver that allowed the state to arbitrarily lower the Prop 98 guarantee if 2 factors occurred. Those 2 factors are whether state income taxes have been delayed by more than 2 weeks, and then also that collection of tax revenues amounts to roughly 50 or majority 51% of the state's overall budget revenues. So we're currently in litigation, suing the state for that, because we feel that is an unconstitutional effort to undermine Prop 98. And so what we're seeing now, as opposed to a renewal of the first maneuver, we're seeing a second maneuver. So that second maneuver here is a withholding of Prop 98 dollars. So what the state had originally had proposed was a $1.6 billion withholding. money that would otherwise gone to districts in the current year. And they're saying, no, we're gonna withhold up to 1.3 billion. So it's been revised down by 300 million, but it still is a withholding of what is otherwise considered a guarantee. Now, why is the state doing this? As you may know, the state is heavily reliant on a number of revenue sources, sales taxes, income taxes, corporate taxes. These are all very volatile, can really result in the boom bust cycles that we have seen in the recent years. And so to kind of hedge against that, the governor's proposing withholding 1.3, saying, hey, we're going to give you this money when we reconcile the budget next year. Until then, we're going to keep this, and it's not going to go out to schools. Well, that is actually not how Prop 98 works. And so we very much see this as a manipulation of Prop 98 and how the guarantee is calculated. When it is formula driven, and because it's formula driven, the money is directly allocated to schools to be able to meet that guarantee. Manipulating those calculations are not something that keeps with the spirit and intent and the purpose of Prop 98. And so we are opposed to this maneuver number 2. And as we note here on this slide, obviously we're in litigation on maneuver number 1, but also here we are potentially looking at engaging in similar actions on maneuver number 2 if we're unable to get it removed from the governor's budget, or from the state budget, I should say. I'll also point out that this is the second year or second time in as many years that we are seeing a Prop 98 maneuver. This is really concerning because it's setting a dangerous trend. It's setting a precedent to lower Prop 98 in lieu of some other aspects on the non-98 side of the budget. And so because we're seeing, as Patrick's noted, some real growths on obligations to the non-98 side of the budget, right, that are putting pressure on Prop 98, you're seeing these efforts to kind of lower the guarantee, if you will. And so that's a real issue, especially when it comes to the fact that Prop 98 is a floor, not a ceiling, right? It is a minimum amount of funding that districts and county offices get. It's not meant to address sufficiency. It's not meant to address adequacy. It's not meant to address what we need for students. It is just a minimum funding guarantee, and any effort to lower that even further is very, very problematic. And so please be on the keep an eye out for future information from CSBA about our advocacy in opposing this maneuver number 2, because this will be one of the major themes moving forward as we advocate before the legislature and the governor. So now I'm going to turn it over to Carlos, who's going to jump in, or I'm sorry, Dan, who's going to jump in and talk about the governor's budget proposal.
All right. So this is a big one, the Student Support and Professional Development Discretionary Block Grant. It's the largest pot of discretionary funds that was included in January. At that time, it was $1.8 billion. It has been reduced by about $100 million down to $1.7 billion. But the structure of the program remains the same. It's still the intent that it's used to address rising costs, as well as certain statewide priorities, particularly professional development and teacher recruitment. However, just want to really hammer home the point that it is specifically rising costs. The trailer bill language right now that is for this program doesn't specify operational costs. So that is something we are continuing to push for, but just want to make sure that's on everyone's radar as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Carlos at this point to cover a few more slides.
Thanks, Dan. So on special education, as Dan noted earlier on the categorical slide, there was that special education will receive the 2.3 COLA increase as a categorical program. And in the next slide, I'll talk about literacy, but want to highlight here that the new in the May revise is $10 million for County Office of Education and UCSF Dyslexia Center partnership to support the use of Multitudes, which is a universal screening tool to help identify learning challenges in schools across the state. Next slide, please. Turning to literacy, there's an investment of $545.3 million for literacy-related support. That remains as part of the May revise from January. This funding is intended to provide LEAs with instructional materials that reflect current reading research. Also, implementation of the English Language Arts, English Language Development Framework, and the rollout of the English Learners Roadmap. That's also support early screening for the risk of reading difficulties. According to the governor's announcement, this will be available to every kindergartner, first and second grader. And then lastly, this funding will also go to literacy coaches program expansion to include mathematics coaches. And then the change in the May revised also includes the addition of $200 million to provide elementary school educators with professional learning aligned to the ELD framework as proposed in AB 454. That's a product of an agreement reached on the literacy instruction reforms. For more information on that bill, please visit CSBA's blog for details in that proposal. Chris will talk next on teacher recruitment.
So this is welcome news. We did see in January some proposals to continue the state's investment in programs that are aimed at addressing the state's workforce shortages, right? And so we did see a effort that to provide $150 million for what was kind of being dubbed as a teacher recruitment program, and which then turned into a loan forgiveness program. Well, that now is being repurposed and recalibrated to provide $100 million. So it's been reduced by $50 million. And that $100 million will go towards providing funds and stipends for student teachers. Now, in terms of the details, we do understand that these student teachers will not include intern credentialed or those who are on an intern credential pathway. These are for full cleared credentials. In regards to how that $100 million, so that please stay tuned in terms of how we are and how we're interpreting what the budget trailer bill is going to require. It adds an additional $14.2 million for the Golden State Teacher Program. You may recall that this is a program, it's a very popular program. It provides two $10,000 grants over 2 years, so $10,000 per year for any student who's enrolled in a credentialing program. So we're increasing that to about $64.2 million. Initially, the investment was $500 million during the middle of the pandemic. Over a period of 5 years, that $500 million went out the door pretty quickly. As you can imagine, has really helped to increase the number of candidates going into the profession. And so that money had expired and had been fully exhausted. And so this additional $64.2 million is welcome and potentially can allow it to exist for another year or so or more. So we're looking forward to seeing that approved in the budget. And then there's additional considerations and extensions for teaching candidates who had received extensions on their reading instruction competence assessment, or RICA assessment. And so this has been in some state of flux, right? There's a state has put a time frame on sunsetting the RICA and providing a new teacher assessment for reading competency and reading instruction through the teacher performance assessments. Those are still to come online, but these additional extensions are allowing those who have predominantly received many of the waivers that extended the time period to meet these requirements to continue one more year. And then on to UTK, or Universal Transitional Kindergarten, and state preschool. I'll just flag real fast here, as Dan had noted on the COLA slide that went through the categorical programs, typically the California State Preschool Program does receive a COLA this year, because we're seeing a reduction and some slight constriction on state funding, if you will, that state COLA for the state preschool program is not being provided. So that is a new development in relation to how the COLA applies to programs that are statutorily laid out in the education code. But in regards to Universal Transitional Kindergarten, we are saying this is the fourth and final year of the full implementation. We are happy to see that the governor committing to continuing to rebench Prop 98 to reflect this enrollment growth. Again, remember that when we say rebench, it means it's adding additional dollars into Prop 98. So if this is the floor for Prop 98 and you're adding money in, this now becomes the new floor, and then 98 grows from there. These are big deals, because whenever you increase Prop 98, it pushes 98 against the other side of the budget. So it's not an easy step for the governor to take. And so we are very appreciative of that and fulfilling his commitment to rebench 98 every year. That is welcome. However, there are and continue to be real implementation challenges, and those implementation challenges have grown. Many have been watching whether or not the state will continue to lower the adult to student ratio for TK classrooms, and they have continued to do that. So for the 25-26 school year, it is intended that the state will be requiring all TK classrooms to go from a 24-1 to a 24-1 to a 20-1, or maybe more importantly, a 12-1 to a 10-1 ratio. There are dollars being provided, 1.2 billion ongoing in Prop 98, to help and assist districts in recruiting and retaining credentialed teachers and other adults to be able to meet those ratio requirements. However, that 1.2 billion is although welcome, is insufficient, and we know that we are also struggling from just the fact that the teachers and credentialed teachers, especially as well as the adults who can serve in these classrooms, don't exist as of yet. And so that kind of speaks to the ongoing implementation challenges that we are seeing, especially relating to facilities, as well as transportation and just the other aspects of our workforce shortages. This is also an area of interest, I know, for many of our basic aid or our community funded districts. I will flag that there was no funding proposed in the budget in either the January budget or the May revised to provide additional dollars for our basic aid or community funded districts, apologies, to be able to fund the growth in universal transitional kindergarten. Moving to ELOP, so this is our Expanding Learning Opportunities Program. As many of you might recall, this was a program that was created in the heart of the pandemic. The intent of this program is to be able to address lost learning opportunities for students as experienced during the pandemic. Many of the function of this program are essentially in the construct of after school, or as the governor might have referred to as high intensity tutoring or other types of supportive programs that are outside of the core school day. This is a flagship program that's been proposed by the governor and his administration, and they continue to invest additional dollars and expand its reach. So this includes maintaining what we saw in the January budget proposal, which was to expand the eligibility of students from 75% of UPP down to 55%. So that expands the number of students who must be offered and be enrolled in the program. They're also increasing the funding allocated for the overall program. We're proposing an additional $435 million in the January budget. They're adding an additional $80.5 million for over 4.5 of ongoing $98. I'd just like to emphasize this. That is a significant amount of Prop 98 funding. We know that there are many school districts and so forth and counties and others who are making good use of these funds, although the funding is starting to be spread over more eligible students, thus reducing the per pupil amount, which can create a real challenge. So just flagging the amount of funding, because this is probably one of the largest categorical grant programs we have seen created since the establishment of the local control funding formula. There is welcome news in regards to from the per LEA grant amount. So it was $50,000 and now it's being bumped up to $100,000 as proposed. This is welcome news, especially for our small school districts where the 50,000 really does not go that far. So the 100,000 or the doubling of that is welcome. But again, this is a very significant amount of ongoing Prop 98 dollars. I'm going to now turn it over to Erica, who's going to talk about school meals.
Good afternoon, everybody. Universal school meals. Great news is the governor is still continuing to add additional funding for universal school meals. While it is down slightly from what was in the January budget proposal, it is still $90.7 million in ongoing Prop 98 funds, which will be used to fully fund the universal meals program. Keep in mind, this is on top of the $1.8 billion that was provided in 24-25. So this is another one of those growing programs that we've got within K-12 education, and the governor is still making this a priority and still continuing to fund the whole program. And I'll turn it back to Chris.
So what are our major takeaways, right? As you heard Patrick describe in the beginning, really the type of impacts that we're seeing on the state budget are predominantly coming from the federal level. Federal actions are really driving influences on our state revenues. The on again, off again tariffs, potential budget cuts that and issues around reconciliation, which Erica will be talking about here shortly, are really having a significant factor, as well as healthcare costs. Healthcare costs continue to go up. The state has made a number of changes to Medi-Cal, the state's healthcare program, in terms of increasing and expanding eligibility for the program. Those costs have also increased on the non-98 side of the budget. So those are things that are omnipresent in terms of the impacts on the overall state budget. With what also, though, at the same time, we are welcoming the governor's general effort to overall protect TK-12 public education funding. Not easy during these difficult budget times, not easy during these unprecedented times at the federal level. But again, we are, though, concerned with this proposed maneuver number 2, right? This is the second time in as many years that we're seeing an effort to lower the guarantee arbitrarily, and thus setting precedents that could be used by future legislatures, by future governors to be able to lower Prop 98 funding, right? Our floor, our minimum amount of funding. So these are our major takeaways for the state, the May revise. And this then, of course, lends into, well, what can you do? So what and how can you be an advocate? So I'm going to turn this over to Patrick, who can help go through that.
Thank you, Chris. Certainly advocacy is one of the major functions of our organization, and it is very important every year, but much more important this year. We've kind of got a multi-front battle we're looking at this year. We need to make sure that Proposition 98 is protected at the state level, but we also need to take a look at what the federal government's doing, literally right now, in the federal budget and how that might impact schools. So what we urge you to do is to advocate for school board members across the state. Okay? Act on our CSBA election action alerts. The CSBA action alerts are very important. Listen, legislators see those and they respond to those. Okay, one just went out this morning. Respond to CSBA's May revise advocacy, and that could be in a variety of methods. Okay, it could be an action alert. It could be asking you to meet with your legislator, us asking you to write to your legislator, or a variety of other things that we may ask of you because they are so important. Again, legislators respond to advocacy. They want to hear from their school board members. School board members are the experts on their schools. Work with your PACER. Your PACER can help you organize activities as well. Your PACER may reach out to you to help organize activities. So watch for those. Speak to the importance of Proposition 98. Proposition 98 is sacrosanct for this organization. If people start messing with it today, or we let them mess with it today, they're going to mess with it tomorrow and forever. So it's very important that we protect Proposition 98. Again, the voters passed it. The voters spoke. They wanted Proposition 98, and we're going to make sure that we keep Proposition 98. Meet with your local elected leaders, build relationships, make sure you know their staff person, okay? Especially their staff person that handles education. Typically, there's one person in the office, probably going to be in Sacramento if it's a state legislator, probably going to be in DC if it's a federal legislator, okay, that handles education for that legislator. Get to know them, know their name, get their email, introduce yourself. Host site visits, very important. Get a legislator out to your school site. Make it fun. Okay? It doesn't have to be real long. Build a relationship with that person and show them the hard work that's going on at your schools and our school board members are doing to ensure student success. Stay in touch with CSBA, build positions, emails, etc. I know everybody gets a lot of emails, but really it's very important that you open these emails, especially when it comes to advocacy, because advocacy is part of the mission of this organization, and it makes a big impact when you are engaged. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take on federal issues now. Chris, if you could go to the next slide, that would be helpful. Federal reconciliation. This is kind of a process they're going through right now in Congress. What is reconciliation? Basically, it's a way for Congress to take expedited actions on certain budget activities without going through the whole budget process. So what they're doing at this point in time, this is to address what is called, and you've probably heard about this in the press, the One Big Beautiful Bill. And this is President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill that would extend the 2017 tax cuts. It would implement a couple of new tax cuts. It provides additional funding for the border, and makes a couple of other changes in funding levels. The issue with taking it to a reconciliation measure and going through this process is that this can be passed on a majority vote in both houses. And in the Senate, that becomes very important. Usually fiscal bills in the Senate require a 61 vote bill. So by going through reconciliation, they can cut that down to a majority vote. The bill has kind of gone through in various components. They've had health component, a nutrition component. You've got a whole variety of things. All of these components actually met yesterday, or should I say last night, and got approved by the House Budget Committee. There are some big concerns with what's in there, though. I mean, there are changes potentially to Medicaid. They're looking to basically cut about $700 billion out of Medicaid in order to fund the increase in the tax cuts, because that's the one piece with the reconciliation. Any tax cuts, any funding that you do has to be paid for. So all of the components that I'm talking about right now are the pieces that will be paying for the tax cuts and for the increased spending on border and a few other programs. So basically, you've got potential cuts to Medicaid. And while it will have a small impact on education, because it will potentially lessen funding for school-based health, mental health services, and potentially for special education health services, this is also going to have a huge impact, though, on families and just the security of children. It would increase the frequency of eligibility redetermination, I could say that word, to every 6 months. Right now, that sits at every year. It would reduce some of the state level payments, potentially by as much as 10%. So that will have a huge impact potentially on the state's budget when you start looking at healthcare costs for Medi-Cal. Because keep in mind, Medi-Cal is the state's component of Medicaid. Medicaid is basically a program that the funding is split between state and federal. And with the state's program of Medi-Cal, this has a potential for some impact. They're also proposing to make changes to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And this is basically the nation's food assistance program. It's a huge program nationally. They're looking to propose expanded work requirement thresholds. They're also looking potentially to shift some of the cost for the first time to the states for this program. So this has another potential to impact students, to impact meal programs in California. You know, we have universal meal programs in schools. If kids aren't getting enough food at home, guess what probably is going to increase for food? The meal programs that we serve students. So this is something to keep in mind. I mean, these are the things that are very questionable about what they're putting forward. However, at the same point in time, for those of you that receive funding from the Secure Rural Schools program, the federal reconciliation bill will provide for an extension of that program through 2029. Yay. There's still legislation out there. So if it doesn't work in this, there's still legislation we'll pursue. But at least they are looking to include that program as necessary for the needs of education in schools. One of the other issues in this legislation, which kind of got slid in at the end, is it would basically have a 10-year moratorium on states passing legislation to deal with AI. There was a huge AI task force last year, artificial intelligence task force, chaired by Representative Obernolte and Representative Ted Lieu from here in California. The report came up with numerous recommendations on potential national policy with regards to AI, the use of AI, all of those sorts of things. What they want to do is kind of preclude states from interfering at this point in time so they can establish that national policy. Problem becomes that they want a 10-year moratorium. 10 years is really, really long, and especially when you're dealing with something like AI. So I'm not sure if the 10-year moratorium lasts, or even if it lasts when this bill goes over to the Senate. At this point in time, as I said, all the components of the reconciliation bill went through the House Budget Committee last night. It is now being passed to the Rules Committee. They are looking to get it out of rules by the middle of this week. The speaker has said, I mean, one of his goals was to get reconciliation, at least in the House, passed by Memorial Day weekend. As of right now, and as of this morning, my understanding is they will not be breaking from Memorial Day weekend or Memorial Day activities until this legislation has passed. Potentially, we're looking at this being on the floor of the House on Thursday. If it does get passed, and it's going to be a big, huge lift to get this passed. They've got a whole variety of politics going on, as many of you have probably heard, both internal to the leadership's own party, but also between the parties in the House. But once they get it passed in the House, it then goes over to the Senate, and we kind of start this process all over again in the Senate. But I think it'll be a little bit faster process over there. So that's kind of what we're looking at for reconciliation. Wanted to let you know, and as Patrick mentioned, there was an action alert that was sent this morning. It should be in your email boxes with regards to reconciliation. Please respond to that action alert. Members of Congress need to hear your thoughts on these issues. So thank you. But let's move on to the 2026 budget. This is something you've probably heard that the president released his skinny version of the 2026 budget. This is something that Congress will be taking up later on this summer, along with basically this will form the basis for them putting together their own version of the budget. It would reinstate the $1 billion school mental health service grants and would restore some of the other health services grants that were suspended by the U.S. Department of Education a month or two ago. It does, I should say, it purports to preserve the core funding formula programs for K-12, the title programs, so Title I through Title V. However, there are some big questions about what that really means. They are proposing, at least under Title I, that they block grant it. At the same point in time, they'd be reducing the funding by $4 billion. There is no detail as to what's in that block grant. And that's the big question right now. So we're waiting for further details, because if you're going to combine it into a block grant, which might not be a bad idea, but you're cutting $4 billion, that's not keeping funding level and not disrupting services. So it raises some big, huge questions. They kind of do the same thing in special education. They would take 7 of the special ed programs, combine them into a block grant, supposedly with more flexibility for parents and schools. But the problem, as you all know, IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is very, very prescriptive. And there's no mention in any of this language about what statutory changes they may or may not be looking for. So, I mean, raising lots and lots of questions. So this is something that you'll be hearing from CSBA a lot over the next 4 or 5 months. You know, the reality is the new fiscal year starts October 1. So they got to have a budget by then, be it a continuing resolution, be it an actual budget act. They've got to do something. So there's going to be a lot of questions. But really right now, the main focus for the House and frankly for the Senate is going to be this reconciliation bill that's going on. So it's busy. You'll be hearing a lot from us on these issues over the next number of months, and we appreciate your attention to the action alerts we send out. So thank you very much. And I'll turn it back over to Patrick.
Great. Thank you, Erica. And remember, we have our annual May revision budget workshops coming up. They're going to occur all around the state. There's a link there. I believe that link's also been placed in the chat for you to look up when a budget workshop is going to be held near you. There are also 2 virtual budget workshops that you can sign up for. But again, these are happening all around the state. If you're not familiar with them, They actually are your chance to really hear it live in person from us and our partners about what's going on with the May Revise. We encourage you to come. We encourage you to bring other school board members and your administrators to these workshops as well. Thank you.
One thing I'll just add in terms of the workshops, please, if you can't attend some of them, there are 2 of them that are virtual. So please do feel free to sign up for the virtual workshops so that you're also can participate if you're unable to attend one in person.
Great. I want to thank our panelists for that rich trove of information they had to offer, but we're not done yet. We're now going to move on to the question and answer section of the presentation. We'll jump right in. The first question involves transitional kindergarten. We actually have a couple questions on this issue, so I'll collapse them into one question. First off, is there any discussion about funding transitional kindergarten in community funded or basic aid districts? And then there's also a related question about a separate piece of legislation, AB 1391, which aims to provide funding, I believe, for basic aid and necessary small schools to roll out TK. So overall, the question is there any relief coming for basic aid districts as it relates to transitional kindergarten, be that through the budget process or through freestanding legislation like AB 1391?
So unfortunately, the answer is not one you're going to want to hear. There was no money proposed in the January budget. There was no money proposed in the May revise to that effect to provide additional, dollars for our community funded or basic aid school districts in helping to address the costs of implementing UTK. As many of you might be aware, for many basic aid districts, they don't get the additional dollars necessarily for UTK. So these additional dollars that are coming through the rebenching 98 are not being afforded to basic aid or community funded districts. That said, there is, and I appreciate the mention of legislation, this AB 1391. This legislation by Assemblymember Addis out of the San Luis Obispo area on the Central Coast has authored legislation to provide an additional amount of funding on a per pupil rate basis for UTK or programs for basic aid school districts. We will see whether or not the bill is able to move forward. The bill is currently in the Assembly Appropriations Committee at the moment. And given the state of the budget, there will be some aspects of it that will have a significant fiscal impact. So it remains to be seen whether or not the bill has yet to go through the full process, I'll just say. And so the legislature has until this September to act upon it.
Thank you, Chris. We'll now move on to ELOP, which is something we touched on in the presentation, and deal with some follow-up questions on that issue. One of our members wants to know whether ELOP is something districts can opt out of for the next school year. And then a different member wants to know whether CSBA has been or could advocate for flexibility in using ELOP funds for use during the school day. They cite the specific example where many students in their rural area ride the bus an hour or more to and from school. And so the after school component is not really viable in their situation. So could those monies be flexed for in-school programming that would better support their students?
Both very good questions. Very apropos. What I'll say is, in relation to opting out, the answer is unfortunately no, not at this time. ELOP money goes out like an apportionment. So similar to how you receive your LCFF apportionment, it comes in the same fashion on a per pupil rate based upon your UPP numbers. And then districts and local educational agencies are required to act upon that in response to the program. And so currently there is no opt-out. This continues to be an area where CSBA is highlighting and is addressing this as it relates to the substantial amount of ongoing Prop 98 dollars that are being allocated to a program that is arguably outside the core academic day. And so CSBA has been one, if not the only organization that has been raising this issue in the legislature. That said, in terms of flexibility, unfortunately, because of the way that it's currently constructed, to the question about using it for transportation funds or transportation costs, the answer is unfortunately no. One thing I'll flag in that regard is that I'm going to read between the lines on the person's question and speak to the fact that last year's budget requires now the districts that are operating ELOP or operating ELOP programs, if they're operating at certain school sites and not at others, they are required to offer transportation from the non-ELOP school site to the ELOP school site. So it did without additional funds. So it is actually raising costs to operate ELOP for many local educational agencies across the state. And so this continues to be an area of concern and focus. But what I'll say also is that this is a priority program, priority initiative for the governor. This is a legacy program meant to address the lasting impacts, or I shouldn't say lasting impacts, but the lost learning impacts caused by the pandemic. Obviously, we're now a couple of years out from the major impacts of the pandemic, so it remains to be seen how and whether the legislature or maybe a future governor will choose to address ELOP in the coming years.
Thank you, Chris. The next question concerns California community schools. Is there any discussion or expanding on continuing the California Community Schools Partnership Program? Our district received a 5-year grant a few years ago, and the cliff is coming up. We've successfully implemented several critical supports and programs that will require ongoing funding. So the question becomes, for those districts that have made investments, can they reasonably expect ongoing funding that would allow them to support those investments they've made, or would those funds have to come internally from the district or COE, presumably diverting funds from another worthy cause?
So I'm going to ask Erica to also help jump in on this one as well. But what I can share is that we have not seen any additional funding proposed in the state budget or in the May revise in relation to the community schools grant program. Let me kind of pass it over to Erica to help in terms of the spirit and purpose of the program. And then also I know Dan can help jump in as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the issues behind kind of the community schools program was to get these programs up and running and to have school districts start funding these programs, because these were grant programs to districts. There has been some discussion at the federal level on community schools, but nothing definitive coming out of there yet. I think as more districts approach the end of this first 5-year tranche of grants, there's going to have to be greater discussion about how do we continue these programs, especially with the community benefits that are also included with the community schools. Hey, Dan, I don't know if you've got more to add specifically on that, but
Just kind of one minor note. Proposed trailer bill does allow any returned funds from the program to be reallocated for extended implementation grants, which would move you from 5 years to 7 years. Not really clear on how much funding is actually still out there after the last round was just allocated, but that is potentially one possibility before you move on to it's entirely on your own budget.
But we can look and try to come up with and see if there are some numbers out there that we can maybe share with you.
Thanks to the three of you for that response. And I should note, you can always send us questions to csba@csba.org. That's our main email account, and it will get routed to the correct person. Or if you have the email addresses of specific staffers, feel free to contact them and they can reply directly if you have a particular question that hasn't been answered through the webinar or elsewhere. Our next question deals with advocacy. We talked quite a bit about the advocacy CSBA has been doing, both our recent visit to Washington, D.C. for Coast to Coast, the action alert that we sent out this morning urging Congress to take action that supports Medicaid and SNAP programs that impact our students. We sent a budget letter last week to every member of the California congressional delegation, but those forms of advocacy are more aimed at the school board members and superintendents. This member is asking, what advocacy can we recommend to parents in schools to amplify the message that we're sending as education leaders?
Thank you, Troy. Why don't I grab that one, and anyone else can jump in if they so desire. With regard to bringing in parents, well, first I'd back up and say bringing in others, right? Okay. I always advocate that when people do go to advocate, that they bring partners with them when they can. And who might those partners be? They might be labor. When you can, advocate with them, bring them to your meeting if you can. Okay. It might be a PTA, a school organization like that. It might be other community groups. But the more groups, if you will, the coalition that you can bring to meet with legislators when appropriate, I urge you to do that. Now, when you talk about getting parents involved, certainly you can design your own program, if you will, to engage your own community, those folks you represent on your own. You can also partner with PTA to do that. That's what I would suggest. But those are just two ways you can engage the community you represent. Again, directly you, maybe PTA, and maybe even there's other organizations where you can build an organization that you can go then do that as well for yourselves. Erica?
Yeah, I was going to say, one thing you can do is take a screenshot of what we send you and share some of that with parents, because I think they'd be just as interested in hearing what you're advocating on and where they can help. Provide them with the numbers, with the contact, with an email address for your local state, Senate, and Assembly offices, and also for the congressional office, because the easiest way for parents to reach out to them is if they have a phone number they can call. So I would strongly urge you to make sure you've got that information available to share with your parents also.
Yeah, to sort of expand on Erica's point, I think it's very helpful to sort of draw the connection between actions that happen in the State House here in Sacramento or in the Congress in DC and what the impacts are going to be for your local community. It may not be obvious to everyone, for instance, how Medicaid could have a significant fiscal impact on your school, even for those students and families who are not direct participants in Medicaid, because any funding that goes to backfill an issue like that means that there's less funding for other purposes. And that's just one of hundreds of examples we could offer. We write a lot about these topics at the risk of self-promotion on the CSBA blog, where we try to write about them in a more accessible manner and break those down for lay audiences. And a lot of that content is also captured in the weekly blast that CSBA sends out every Wednesday afternoon. So there's a lot of good material there that could be repurposed in a newsletter to your local community, to the parents and families, or possibly put on your website, discussed at a board meeting to increase understanding and perhaps urgency among members to push for support of public schools. So that's just one other avenue to consider. Moving on, what's the difference in special education funds from last year to this year? I assume they mean from the current year that we're in to the proposed 2025-26 budget.
Yeah, at this point in time, my understanding is it's basically the same funding. The only difference will be the 2.3% COLA, cost of living increase, which I've yet to get an actual number on, which I need to find. But as far as coming from the Fed, I mean, that's at the state level. Coming from the federal level, we still have to figure that out because, as you know, you got funded in 2024 at the federal level. 2025 funding was a continuing resolution, which means you were flat funded. You got no COLA out of the federal government, or we got no COLA out of the federal government. There was no cost inflation factors in any of the provisions of education funding under a continuing resolution. So basically, it's flat funding. I tend to think of it as a slight cut in funding because there's nothing in there that keeps up with what your increased costs actually were. So it's a dicey number at this point. We're still trying to figure out what all of the full programmatic numbers are based upon May revise, and even more closely what it's going to be coming out of the federal government. I would not guess that the federal government will have a very large increase in funding for FY 2026, which is what's coming up. Which unfortunately, I mean, you roll all this together and it is going to have an impact on your local funding or your local budgets as far as how you're going to cover all the costs. And it is something that we're going to have to take to Congress very much so for the FY26 budget. And we're potentially going to have some discussions with the state on we've got to have funding. I mean, there is no getting out of doing services for students in special education. There is a federal mandate there, there's state mandates. And so that is a discussion that we're going to have as you go through a couple of years of flat funding in special ed. So sorry, I can't be more positive, but at least there wasn't a cut at the state level, and it will continue. And you do get a COLA this year, at least in the state budget, and we're going to think positive about that. And then we'll go forward with 2026 at the federal level and fight tooth and nail to get some acknowledgement that we have to have increased funding from the federal government. So.
Yes, and I just want to reiterate that it's been a matter of consistency for CSBA, and we reiterated it as recently as last week in our budget request letter that we want the federal government to establish a defined pathway to meet its 40% obligation to pay for the state and local share of special education. That's an ongoing battle for us, but we know that won't happen overnight, but we at least want to get a commitment for some sort of timeline or schedule that will map out what states can expect for the federal government to eventually fulfill the promise it made over 40 years ago when IDEA was adopted. I also should mention, and this is related to the question about advocacy, that we have a budget resources page on the CSBA website. If you type in CSBA budget resources into your web browser, that will be the first result. And a lot of the documents that we're referring to are statements and analysis and budget request letter to different organizations will be there. And that's information that you can use and distribute to your communities as well. Moving on to the next question, is there any chance of construction grants to replace 40-year-old portables?
Well, oh, go ahead, Patrick.
Troy, could you repeat the question?
The question was, is there any chance of construction grants to replace 40-year-old portables? But just in general, is there additional money for facilities beyond the recent bond that was passed?
The short answer through the state budget is no, but there's always a state schools facility program. You can reach out to the Office of Public School Construction. They have a whole program designed to assist school districts with their school facilities, building new school facilities, rehabbing older school facilities. And so the facilities that are over 25 years old, actually they have money set aside in the school bond to assist districts in enhancing those older structures. So again, I encourage you to contact the Office of Public School Construction because they have a variety of offerings for districts with their school facilities issues. But in the state budget, no.
Thank you, Patrick and Dan. Are there any back of the napkin estimates for dollars per ADA on the SSPD discretionary block grant estimates? Or is money per ADA for TK an add-on?
Yes to both. On the discretionary block grant, I would assume somewhere around $320, give or take a little bit. We have what the amount of funding will be. It's just a question of what is the final ADA that it's divided by and how much ADA is attributed to the state special schools. So $320, very back of the napkin, very rough. As far as TK add-on, that's actually specified in statute. So it is $5,545 per TK ADA. Again, assuming the budget passes as is and that's not amended throughout the process.
Thank you. Does the May revise include the proposal to restore Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant Funds, $378.6 million?
Apologize, that's also mine. Yes, there was no changes to that proposal, which was initially included in January in the May revise, so that stands as is.
Our next member is asking for an update on AB 1390.
I can get that, Troy. So that's CSBA sponsored bill on board member compensation that bill is passed out of the Assembly Education Committee. It's now sitting on the Assembly floor, and it will be taken up in the next several days to start the process over in the Senate side.
Thank you, Carlos. Would you take a moment for those who are unfamiliar to expand on some of the specific provisions in the bill?
Sure. So there are thresholds in statute. Below that threshold, a board could approve an increase in their compensation by any percentage. And then above that threshold, it's limited to just 5% increments. So that threshold is different based upon your ADA, and that threshold has not been adjusted in 40 years for both school district governing boards and county boards of education. 1390 would adjust that threshold amount to reflect the impact of inflation over that time, and also the increased workload that board members are experiencing. So this will give boards more flexibility to set those rates to reflect that workload, and also it leaves it entirely up to the board. It's up to the board's discretion. The bill will not result in increases just by its passage, but just gives you the discretion to make those changes in compensation that you feel are appropriate in your area.
Stay on, Carlos, because the next question is also in your wheelhouse. We have a couple people wondering about the appropriation for ethnic studies, which has not been included in any of the budget proposals to date. Do we see that happening?
Sure. So back in January, the governor's staff was very explicit in what they had indicated, that the budget would not include an increase or a appropriation for ethnic studies, basically signaling to the legislature, that's the way that we're reading it, is that if you want to fund this, it's going to have to come from the legislature. So we haven't seen that yet. We have seen a couple bills on ethnic studies late last session and again this session to change the requirements around ethnic studies. The specific bill on ethnic studies that we saw reintroduced this year, the authors decided not to move forward with it. So we're kind of in a holding pattern to see what reforms the legislature wants to make. And we're looking at that carefully, because one of the provisions in AB 101 was that districts were required to offer an ethnic studies course beginning with the 25-26 school year. That provision is not operative right now because it requires an appropriation. So if there's going to be appropriation made, we want to make sure that there's going to be a change to push that deadline out so that districts that haven't already implemented it will have time to do so. There is a bill to look more broadly at discrimination that was introduced as a gut and amend last week. That bill is AB 715. We're looking closely at that. It's related somewhat to ethnic studies, but it's looking at issues of discrimination, anti-Semitism more broadly. So we will keep you updated on that bill, and as we get more information on ethnic studies in news alerts and other means.
Thanks. Appreciate that explanation, Carlos. Our next member is asking whether there is any news about AB 1009. I'm not sure if we are tracking this bill. If I understand correctly, I think it's related to occupational therapists. I know it is being reviewed by the Commission on Teacher Credentialing. I'm not sure if anyone here has any more information about that. That's a little bit outside the scope of the budget.
Yeah, so I'll just say real quickly, the bill is moving along. It's passed the Assembly, it's currently in the Senate, and allows essentially administrative services credentials to be awarded to occupational and physical therapists. So an issue that's been continuing to be discussed in the legislature.
Great. Thank you, Chris. A question about this presentation. Is it the same presentation that will be shared at the upcoming budget presentation meetings, or is it different? Having been to many of these, I can say the presentation at the upcoming budget meetings is different than what we've done here. There are certainly certain elements will be covered again, but it's worthwhile when there's new information, different presenters and different perspectives. So I would encourage everyone to either watch virtually or to attend the meeting in their area. I don't think it will be redundant with this, and it would be worth your time. Moving on, how will the chaos in the markets affect PERS and STIRS rates for this and possibly the next 4 years?
Thanks, Troy. So typically the pension systems in the state do have a longer horizon in terms of when they are looking for to take gains out of the market. However, the chaos does create some consternation in both systems as it relates both to employee contribution rates for those employees that are covered under PEPRA and also for employer contribution rates. And now we have both systems. They specifically referring to CalSTRS, which has regained its ability to adjust its employer rates. So we will be watching those closely. It's too early right now to know if those will directly result in increases, but any loss does have to be made up, and we'll continue to monitor those at both of those systems going forward.
Thank you, Carlos. One of our members says that the IDEA funding looked like it was trying to fund the full 40%. Was I misreading that? So if we could just clarify.
We would love it for it to fund the full 40%. But the federal budget, no, it has not gotten that far. However, there is legislation that was reintroduced by Congressman Huffman to set up a glide path for the 40%. And I mean, that's what it's going to need to be. And there's lots of discussion around pushing for that 40% funding, or at least moving the needle a little bit closer to I mean, I don't know if we'll ever get to 40%, but I'll take 20%. Right now, we're lucky in California if we even get 10. So, I mean, there is always a push, though, to move that needle forward, to move that needle up the funding scale. One of the bigger problems, and it's, as you're seeing with just the sheer numbers that they're talking about in the reconciliation package of, trying to find $4.5 trillion and $880 billion cuts to Medicaid, this is a multiple $billion. It's probably $20 to $22 billion to get us on track for the 40%. So it's a huge amount of money. But there is always the push. And I always think we need to make sure that we keep it in the front of Congress's mind. You established this mandate. You need to fund this mandate if we are ever going to be able to provide all the services that special education students deserve and are required to have.
Yes, I would just add that when we were in DC for our federal advocacy trip coast to coast, that this was probably the #1 issue that united school districts and county offices of education of all types, suburban, urban, rural, small, medium, and large, no matter which part of the state, is getting the federal government to fulfill its 40% share obligation. And so we take that very seriously and are always going to continue to fight for that. The next question returns to the transitional kindergarten and the dollars per ADA. We may have already addressed this, but just to be certain, the members estimating that the ADA for the TK add-on would be ongoing at $5,545 plus COLA for the future years. Is that accurate, or can we provide more context there?
That is accurate. So that 505.45 is the base, and then it would be adjusted by COLA going forward.
Thanks for confirming, Dan. And then one member asks if in our future updates, we would keep members apprised of SB 98, a study to redirect funding or to determine funding by enrollment as opposed to the current ADA model. That study is supposed to be completed and there's supposed to be a report, I understand, by January 2026. Do we have any news on if that's proceeding apace?
So I appreciate the question, and I'm going to take a little bit of editorial liberty here, and I'll just say, yes, we will definitely keep our membership apprised of SB 98 and the resulting report requirement. It's currently being undertaken by the state's nonpartisan legislative analyst's office, not due like the person had asked until next year, but we certainly will. Now, in regards to SB 98 and its predecessor bill, I will say that these are bills that CSBA actually opposed when they were in their original form. And I want to emphasize in their original form. So what they originally proposed to do was to say, okay, we're going to give you the difference between ADA and your enrollment, but then we're going to prescribe to you how you can spend that money. And we're going to put on a maintenance of effort requirement. So essentially what the bills would say is you don't just get the additional dollars to use as you see fit. You have to use them in a fashion that basically follows the same kind of, spirit of an unfunded mandate, if you will. And so that was always been something that CSBA has opposed, because if the state was to ever move to an enrollment-based funding methodology for LCFF, it has to be done in two major ways. One is it has to be done clean, in that if we're going to move to enrollment-based funding, it must be done in a fashion where that additional dollars comes with no strings attached, and it should be provided to districts and county offices to utilize based upon their local priorities. And two, it has to come with a commensurate increase in Prop 98. Remember, Prop 98 makes about 40% of the state budget. Of Prop 98, LCFF makes up around 80%-ish, give or take, right? And so if you're going to increase LCFF within Prop 98, you're going to push it into the rest of these other issues that are, some would argue, are equally as important or also important. And so if it's not done with a commensurate increase, a rebenching of 98, you're actually cutting that Prop 98 pie into smaller pieces. So again, it has to be done cleanly, and it has to be done with a commensurate rebenching of Prop 98. I'll go one step further, because I know a lot of folks were always surprised when they found that CSBA had a support if amended, or sorry, an oppose unless amended position on the original forms of SB 98 and its predecessor. One thing I'll just say in addition to this is that if we're going to move, if we calculate, if you move to enrollment-based funding, it would calculate to about $4 billion, give or take, in terms of additional dollars statewide. This is pre-pandemic, of course. If we did that, then not all districts would benefit, because not all districts have lower, substantially lower ADA or have chronic absenteeism issues or other issues for that matter. If we put that $4 billion into the LCFF base, it actually would do more in terms of the per pupil LCFF apportionment than if it was put in via an enrollment-based funding methodology. Just something to think about. It is part of the nuts and bolts of when we have these conversations about and moving to enrollment-based funding, what is the best approach? So I just flag those as additional issues to consider, but certainly we will be keeping all of our membership apprised of the report once the LAO does issue it next summer.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to all of our panelists for the time and information you've given today. Again, we will send out the recording of this webinar as well as the slide deck our panelists have used. You should be receiving that by tomorrow afternoon if you've registered for this event. You can also go to CSBA's Budget Resources webpage for most of the information that we've discussed today as well. And we will keep you informed through all our communications about developments in the budget process. Thanks for joining us today. Good luck with your budgets and in continuing to support your students in the important work you do. Goodbye.